Good afternoon. Um, Good afternoon from Dubai, where the temperature is currently 25 degrees and it's cloudy, and we don't get to say that often in this part of the world, famed for its year-round sunshine and extremely high irradiation levels. Good afternoon. My name is Jennifer Aguinaldo. I am MEED's Energy and Technology Editor. I will be presenting this webinar in the next hour or so. Most of the data and analysis I will be presenting this afternoon will come from a premium intelligence report, um, called MENA Power, where where it's a huge 450-page report that looks into the regulations and policies, demand and supply trends, projects pipeline, key stakeholders, and the background of the projects in each of the 17 countries that we cover in that report. And right, and it's usually a very helpful business development tool for those of you who are looking to expand your presence in the region or to win more projects across the region. And during the webinar, we will also be conducting a series of poll questions, and we would appreciate especially the EPC contractors if you can take time to participate in that in those polls, and we will be sharing the results with you as soon as they come in. And towards the end of the webinar, there will be a survey as well, where you can scan the QR code, complete the survey, and then receive a report, the hydrogen report, which is worth about $2,000. We're encouraging you to send your questions throughout during the webinar, and I will try to answer those questions in the last 15 minutes of this presentation. Everyone, all of you will be receiving a copy of the slides at some point during the webinar as well. Right, so it's been an interesting 10 or so years since the Middle East and North Africa region, or most countries in this region, started launching their energy diversification programs. So the intervening years between 2014 and now basically saw the largest utility scale solar renewable energy projects with the lowest tariffs, world record low tariffs, basically because of the scale of those projects, the credit rating of the companies, the irrigation levels in this region, among others. It's also interesting that, of course, as we all know, COVID-19 pandemic broke during that period, and there was also the Russia-Ukraine conflict, which have basically resulted in supply chain constraints in terms of renewable energy or gas turbines. Interestingly, in December, the COP28 UAE consensus, as we call it, basically called for a gradual transition from fossil fuels. And of course, if you remember, 8 of the Middle East and North Africa countries basically signed up in the initiative to triple renewable energy capacity by 2030. So that provides a very interesting backdrop in terms of today's webinar, where we're going to look at both conventional and renewable energy and where the trend is pointing in terms of capacity procurement, among others. Right. So needless to say, the region has been growing by an average. The population growth in this region has been at a rate of 2% annually, which is almost twice the global average. So that means more demand for water, food, infrastructure, social services, and which means a staggering demand for electricity. Economic diversification program, we have Vision 2030 in Saudi Arabia and nearly every other country entering the execution phase of their long-term economic diversification program. So there's industrialization. Saudi Arabia basically, for instance, wants to expand into mining apart from its existing petrochemical industrial complexes. 2 weeks ago, I was in Riyadh where they launched ALAT, which is the PIF subsidiary focusing at transforming Saudi Arabia into an electronics and semiconductor hub globally. And then, of course, you've got the energy transition and net zero objectives with several countries, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, Oman, having already articulated their desire to achieve net zero by 2050 or 2060. That means higher penetration of electric vehicles, higher electrification levels in transportation and infrastructure, among others, which will, of course, demand more electricity. Then, of course, I would assume that nearly all of you have heard about the green hydrogen plants across the region. Morocco, Egypt, Oman, Abu Dhabi, and Saudi Arabia, they're all they all express a desire to become global hydrogen hubs. If the three countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Oman basically manage to realize their target to create to produce 1 million tons of green hydrogen, each of them by 2030, then that would require renewable energy capacity of about 60 gigawatts, which is almost twice Oman's current installed capacity. So enormous demand for electricity if these projects get off the ground. And then, of course, part of the energy transition and efficiency drives would be tapping AI and increased automation and the establishment of data centers, and depending on how policies go, perhaps even cryptocurrency adoption in this region. All those require the establishment, setting up of data centers across the region, which is, of course, and another energy intensive industry given the cooling requirements that those facilities require. That leads us to problems, to issues. So I forgot to mention earlier that in the past 12 or 18 months, we've seen a resurgence. So basically, a decade ago, there was that big push for renewable energy to decarbonize the electricity systems. But the last 12 to 18 months, we've seen a resurgence of gas-fired generation procurement, with Saudi Arabia tendering and awarding the Taiba 1 and 2 and Qasim 1 and 2 gas-fired schemes last year. So basically, so you want as much renewable energy as you can, but to be able to do that, we need more gas generated capacity for grid stability, to address the spinning reserves requirements, and perhaps to replace expiring contracted capacity, whether it's gas fired or oil liquid fuel fired generation. And then, of course, having realized all those things, we have a very strong demand plans or aspirations to install battery energy storage systems that would allow deployment of stored energy. So you have Saudi Arabia about to launch the first 2 gigawatt phase of its battery energy storage system, and then Abu Dhabi with its first 400 megawatt project as well, with the other jurisdictions expecting to launch their battery capacity projects soon. Right, these data that I'm going to present basically will derive from global data projects. MEED is part of global data, which provides business intelligence, among other things. So we're looking at across the 17 countries that we track, the overall installed capacity in 2020 was 442.5 gigawatts. That's expected to increase to around 633 gigawatts by 2030, based on the assumptions that were taken, and that represents a compounded average growth rate of about 4%. Overall, that would mean renewable energy will be growing by around 15% annually on average, while conventional power generation plants capacity will grow by about 3% annually during that period. If you can look at these two charts here, it basically shows the improvement in terms of the capacity accounted for by renewable energy. You have about 8% in 2020, and that's expected to reach 19% by 2030 or during the end of the forecast period. As of last year, the total installed capacity across the 17 states is stood at about 462 gigawatts. And of course, you have Saudi Arabia, Iran being next, Egypt, UAE, Iraq being some of the largest countries in terms of their ranking in terms of overall installed capacity. You're seeing here a small percentage of nuclear power from the UAE and Iran, and that might change somewhat in 2030 with Egypt, with the first reactor expected to come on stream potentially by the end of the decade in Egypt. The ranking will be similar by 2030, except that Oman could go down the ranking with Libya, Morocco taking a more advanced position in the ranking. That's all based on how they are able to procure more capacity during that period. This is an interesting slide. Again, this webinar basically looks at both conventional and renewable energy, and you're looking at a 2023 renewable capacity of about 44 gigawatts. This includes hydropower where they are available, and that's about 9% of the total installed capacity in each of those countries. By 2030, we're looking at, or 2035, depending on the country targets, we're looking at improved or higher level of renewable energy, both wind and solar and hydropower in these jurisdictions. You've got Morocco aiming for 52% by 2030, followed by Egypt aiming for 42% by 2035. And Saudi Arabia, of course, 50% by 2030. That's the interesting thing to look at here is in terms of where are they today. So let's say Saudi Arabia is at 3% and wants to be at 50%, for instance, by in 7 years' time. And indeed, around 15 or 18 gigawatts of solar PV capacity is now, I think, under construction, have been awarded in Saudi Arabia. So from looking at the installed capacities, we're looking at demand. So one of my first slides basically shows at a 4% CAGR between 2020 and 2030 in terms of capacity. And of course, most capacity will be based on demand forecast. So in the region, apart from Abu Dhabi and Oman, which comes up with their annual statement of future capacity requirements, as well as demand forecast, most of this data in this slide are from either global data, MEED, or from independent research. So you've got Saudi Arabia that has been growing by 5.3% annually between 2009 and 18, and this is from COPSARC. And I think the aspiration is to bring that, to slow down the growth through energy efficiency measures, retrofit of buildings, and tariff reforms to bring that down to 1.6%. But that's a data from COPSARC, not from the utility or the principal buyer in Saudi Arabia. We're still waiting for SPPC to reissue its annual capacity statement. They said they will, but we have not yet seen that. For Abu Dhabi, they said EWEC basically said they expect demand for electricity as well as water to grow by an average of 5% annually over the next 11 years until 2035. For Oman's main interconnected system is 3.4%. You've got Jordan growing by 5.12% between 2015 and 2025. So very robust growth and I would so it basically brings us to a compounded average growth of more or less, give or take, 4% over the next 7-10 years. We are now going to look at the contracts awarded by year and by country for the Middle East and North Africa region. So this is something that MEED Projects has been doing very well over the past decade or so. Based on our analysis, the generation contracts awarded during the period 2014 to 2023 amounted to about 166 billion. Sorry, that's billion. We'll make the changes before we send you the slides. That's 166 billion between 2014 and 2023. Oil and gas generation accounted for 55% of those of that value of contracts awarded during that period, while solar and wind accounted together for around 28% and nuclear for about 15%. So it's interesting to note the difference between the share of renewable energy in 2014, which is around 2% of the contracts awarded of around $20.8 billion. 10 years later, in 2023, last year, with a generation contract value of 25.2 billion, you have renewable energy accounting for 35% of that, and conventional or oil and gas power generation declining to 64%, still a very significant share of 64% of the total. And of course, you're also seeing a small share in terms of waste to energy that's being procured in some jurisdictions across the region. No surprises there. Saudi Arabia is, of course, the largest market, having awarded, hold on, sorry. Having awarded close to 40 billion worth of projects during that period. Egypt came next, followed by Iraq, Iran, UAE, and Morocco. So that's power generation. I will look at transmission and distribution contracts awarded by year and country. You've got around 68.5 billion worth of transmission and distribution contracts awarded. That's an average of about 6.8 billion a year awarded during the last 10 years. Again, Saudi Arabia is the largest market. And if you put together the GCC states, they account for about 83% of the total spending of the total contracts awarded for transmission and distribution packages across the region. Now, for most of you, I would suppose this is a most awaited chart in terms of who are the top EPC contractors. So this is exclusively generation projects. So we have Larsen and Toubro being at the top of the list. So these are projects under execution. So they could have been awarded over the past 2 to 3 years or longer. And you have SEPCO 3 in second rank, followed by Egypt's Orascom Construction and Shanghai Electric. We did not include the nuclear for obvious reasons, but this is how things stand today in terms of the top EPC contractors. For those of you who subscribe to MEED, we have an annual developer ranking as well. So for IPP or IWPP projects, we do monitor those, the gross capacity and net capacity of each of those developers. And as of last year, Aqua Power was clearly the top developer in the region. The developer ranking, although, is only for the GCC countries, not for the entire MENA region. For those of you who subscribe to MEED, I would suppose you have that copy of that report that shows the ranking of the developers as well. And this brings us to the first poll question. I would be so grateful if you're able to take your time to answer this question. In the last webinar, the majority of respondents said the skilled worker shortage was the biggest problem they faced. This time we want to understand which specific craft roles are the most problematic. Which one craft below has the biggest shortage in your opinion? We'll give you some time to answer this question and then we'll flash the results once it's available. Thank you. Right. So while waiting for the result of the poll, okay, right. So here we go. 19% of the audience basically said electricians is the one with the highest shortage. The next one is welders, followed by crane operators. Okay. Thank you. And we have another question. If we can do the other one. Over the last 5 years, we have seen an emergence of new contracting models for EPC contracts in the region. Which one of the below contracting models in your company is your company's preference? This is an interesting question. Right. While waiting for the result of the poll, there's a question in terms of how realistic is Saudi Arabia's power capacity 2030 growth targets are. Right. It's a good question for the stakeholders to answer, but as far as I know, they are behind. So if you remember when they set up their 2030 target, they set an intervening target of 24 gigawatts by 2024. Clearly, they're behind that target. So that gives you an indication in terms of how realistic it is. But they are ramping up procurement. If you notice in the past 12 to 24 months, they've been ramping up almost every 6 months or every 8 months, there would be a new round of procurement. So clearly there's the political will to be able to meet that target. Right, in terms of the poll question number 2, what is alternative contracting models that is emerging? It's the EPCM that 29% of you said is preferred by you, followed by lump sum turnkey contract model, which is where 21% said they would prefer that. The third one is design and cost plus EPC by 13%. So that's quite an interesting answer, and thank you so much. Right, now we go back to our next slide. So this I mentioned earlier basically that the push for renewable energy capacity as a means to decarbonize electricity systems across this region has resulted in some of the largest with lowest cost or low tariff renewable energy solar PV projects, IPP projects in the region. This basically presents how the price for these projects have been going up since 2015. So you've got the lowest was Shuaiba 1. I think this is a 200 megawatt. Is it 200 or 600 megawatts? So this is in Saudi Arabia. It was was awarded in 2021. Aqua Power proposed to develop it for 1.04 cents a kilowatt hour. So that has been the historic low. And since then, of course, we know that the COVID-19 pandemic and then the result and the conflict in Russia and Ukraine resulted in an extreme in interruption in terms of the supply chain, in terms of commodity prices, which have sent the tariffs or levelized cost of electricity for these projects higher. Of course, there would be some opinions where that figure was not very realistic in the first place, but that would be an opinion held by people other than Aqua Power, of course. But these projects, a number of these projects are now operational. You've got the first five phases, for instance, of Mohammed bin Rashid Solar Park, now operational. Well, the fourth phase, which has concentrated solar power, has been inaugurated in December last year. So that's a very interesting project. If you ever drive past or cycle past that area inside Al Dahal Road, about 50 kilometers of the main city in Dubai, then you'd see the solar tower, which is quite a nice, which is quite a nice sort of accent in that area. So it's a gleaming solar tower. All right. So the trend over the past few months, the last leads that have been awarded, the last project that has been awarded would be the Hinakia solar IPP in Saudi Arabia. The tariff was 1.68 cents a kilowatt hour. That's 1,100 megawatts, and the Tubarjo solar PV received a Jinko Power proposed 1.71 cents a kilowatt hour. So clearly the trend is going upward in terms of prices. So some experts say that we're at that stage where we've reached the end of the race to the bottom. It's all about which project cost the least. But other people that I've been talking to say there's still room for a further decline depending on the jurisdiction. Let's say for Saudi Arabia, because they do proper pre-development works, permitting, and of course the sovereign credit rating of the country as well. So it's still a mixed bag, but I would tend to concur that the trend could be going upwards. This has been a key issue that I've been hearing from the people I talk to, from experts, technology suppliers, developers, and EPC contractors, that we've reached a seller's market in terms of EPC, in terms of technology, in terms of gas turbines, boilers, wind turbines even. So the supply chain problem arose from the decision by some electronic OEMs basically to reduce capacity over the past few years, owing to a combination of the COVID-19 pandemic and the threat of curtailed demand to push to decarbonize electricity systems. So some experts tell me that they have already a committed capacity and it's difficult to respond to the demand. As of today, Saudi Arabia has awarded Taiba and Qasim 1 and 2, but they've also recently tendered the 7.2 gigawatts of gas-fired IPPs for Rima and Nairia. And then, of course, you have the Qatar and Kuwait, also North 2 and 3, and Al Kiran 1, which is expected to still come to the market. Plus, outside the GCC, you have Iraq, for instance, has been coming up with a lot of announcements in terms of new projects. Libya might be coming with more projects as well. So this is a situation that is expected to be temporary or cyclical, and that the prices will stabilize. So I think the main issue that I'm hearing is that the value of the EPC cost has nearly tripled from where they were in 2019 or before the COVID-19 pandemic began and before all these capacity constraints issues came to light. So these numbers that I have in this slide are based on our internal data, excluding the IWPP projects, where it's difficult to extract the cost of the power plant from the water desalination plant across the region, and with input from some of the experts, from these experts that I've been talking to. So clearly, we're facing a seller's market, as everyone prefers to call it, but the cost these might be temporary and could stabilize as prices for commodity and raw materials such as steel or aluminum will be less volatile. In terms of planned and unawarded generation projects across the Middle East and North Africa region, so these we have around 53 billion worth of generation projects that are currently under bid across those 17 states. So these are projects that have already been bid, or where the clients have already received the bids, or projects where the bidding process is underway. So of this total, of this 53 billion, about 47% are wind or solar, and the rest, 27%, is accounted for by oil, gas powered, mainly gas powered generation capacity. I've got another question, another poll question, if you can indulge me. What is your company's current attitude to contracting risk in the region? If you can please have a look and vote, and it will be interesting to see what you all think in terms of the risks involved in project. Okay, we've got the results to these questions. Right, we are increasingly becoming more risk averse is the top answer, with almost half, 41% of the audience of you saying that is your current attitude. It has not changed, 31%, and we are increasingly taking on more risk. That is for 20% of you in the audience. Thank you. Right, so let me proceed with the planned and unawarded generation projects in terms of our analysis. So in the earlier slide, I was presenting the value of projects that are under bid. These graphs would show us the size of planned and unawarded projects. So it's significantly higher. It's 232 billion, and this has already been moderated, if you will, by taking out some of the projects that have been around for so long and that have not been really shown any sign of moving forward. So these are the planned and unawarded generation projects across the Middle East and North Africa region, about 232 billion of them. And if you look at the breakdown between energy sources or technology, you've got solar accounting for about 61, solar and wind together. If you put solar and wind together, accounting for 61% of the total unawarded and known projects being planned in the region. So this includes projects under study, under FEED, and under pre-qualification phases. Oil and gas, still significant at 55 billion or 24% of the total. And then you've got nuclear coming on mainly from Egypt, and then waste to energy, hydropower and geothermal being very minor in terms of planned projects. Saudi Arabia, of course, has the largest value of planned and unawarded projects. If you take into consideration that they are aiming to install 58.7 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2030. And along with that, it would be the expansion of gas generation fleet to enable them to stabilize the grid as more renewable energy come on stream. So these are the generation projects. Egypt comes second. Iran, which is also planning to expand its nuclear power plant. Of course, in Saudi Arabia, the first nuclear plant project, the Waihin nuclear plant, which is, I think it's 2.8 gigawatts, if I'm not wrong, that is also under bid. And I think the bids are due by end of this month, but the people I've been talking to says that deadline will likely be extended again. So Egypt, Iran, Morocco, Kuwait are your the top sources of opportunities or projects over the next 4 or 5 years. The UAE also plans to expand renewable energy. Dubai said it will no longer procure gas generation, and Abu Dhabi basically said that gas is an important transition fuel. In fact, they might come to the market with Tawila C and another gas-fired project this year or over the next 12 to 18 months. But the plan really is to gradually reduce dependence on gas-fired generation and eliminate it potentially completely by 2050. Right. These are some of the selected unawarded generation projects that we have seen in our system and that I've been covering actively in the past weeks or months. In Kuwait, of course, is it coming? Is it happening? Is it not happening? But I think the intention is there for them to issue the RFP sometime this year. In Morocco, the third phase of Nurmidelt IPP is under is in the pre-qualification phase, and they're expecting to issue the request for proposals sometime this year. So in Oman, you have IBRI3, a solar IPP, and the Tukum Wind project as well. In Qatar, the bids in Qatar, you have it's under bid. The facility E IWPP is under bid. It was tendered in 2 years ago and retendered, and now finally there is no, this is the first time it was retendered. It was tendered the first time, and then they requested for new prices when the capacity was revised, and now they've tendered it again. I've mentioned the Waihin nuclear plant project in Saudi Arabia. That will be the first large-scale nuclear power plant in the kingdom. And NEOM, yesterday, of course, they've received the bids for the Shikri solar power plant and the Gael wind farm project in NEOM, which are being procured as EPC projects. The first, there's also, along with that, there's a plan to procure up to 55 gigawatts of renewable energy for NEOM. At least that's the number that we have collected from all the pre-development studies that have been announced or that are in the public domain. So the first 3 gigawatts solar phase of the massive capacity procurement in NEOM is about to start. It's expected to start soon. And for SPPC, I've mentioned already NIREA and RIMA. These are 7.2 gigawatts taken together, 4 of them. I think the bids are due sometime in June, if I'm not wrong. And then, of course, the fifth phase of REPDA of the National Renewable Energy Program in Saudi Arabia is under bid. It's 3.7 gigawatts taken together. We're also expecting the award of the wind IPP projects, which will be the second, third, and fourth wind schemes under REPDO, since it was launched, to be awarded sometime this year. For IWEC, that's Shuehan that I forgot earlier. So Shuehan and Tawila, they're under study and pre-qualification. I think there's an urgency to procure these schemes because of the expiring capacity from the existing independent water and power projects in Abu Dhabi. And of course, there's the 400 megawatt battery energy storage system in the UAE. Moving on, in terms of transmission and distribution planned and unawarded contracts, we have about 44.5 billion that are in the pre-execution phase. So in the past few years, with the growth in renewable energy capacity, actual or planned, come the challenge of having to reinforce your grid to enable a more diverse source of energy sources. Let's say in the UAE, you have got nuclear, and sometime soon there will be hydropower from the UAE as well. So there's a need to reinforce the grid to accommodate the growing and diverse energy capacity, electricity capacity. And in some jurisdictions, if you will, there's a need to interconnect. So you've seen projects to interconnect the GCC states among one another, as well as with other regions like Egypt or Iraq, for instance. So there's a lucrative market in terms of overhead lines, substations, and also not to forget the giga projects and the new industrial complexes or valleys being planned in many areas of this region as part of their economic diversification plans, requiring connection, requiring new substations as well. Right. This is I've already talked about the growing need to look for solutions to address the intermittency of renewable energy, as well as to stabilize the grid and maintain reserve capacity. So clients are planning to integrate battery energy storage systems. Saudi Arabia wants plans to install about 10 gigawatts of BESS, battery energy storage capacity, by 2030. So that's that, and Abu Dhabi has started the procurement process that has requested interest from companies who will bid for their first 2 battery energy storage systems. And I think there are plans in Dubai and Oman as well. And of course, the Red Sea, for instance, project, there's a battery energy storage system there built by Huawei, which is now completed, and there's a 400 megawatt battery included in the NEOM Green Hydrogen project as well. And this brings us to a very interesting point in terms of potential green hydrogen clusters in the region. Please do send your questions if you have any, and I will try an attempt to accommodate some of those questions in the next 10 minutes of this webinar. So there are over 70 planned integrated green hydrogen projects that have been announced in the Middle East and North Africa region, mainly Morocco, Egypt, Oman, UAE, and several in Saudi Arabia as well. So as I have mentioned earlier, Oman, UAE, and Saudi Arabia, if they were to realize their goal of producing, whether for export or for domestic demand, 1 million tons of green hydrogen by 2030, that would require about 60 gigawatts of renewable energy that need to be installed. And I'm mentioning that in this power webinar simply because they are still considering, while most of these projects are looking at integrated renewable energy as planned as part of the entire multi-billion-dollar projects that they're planning, there's an option for, let's say, Abu Dhabi. The Department of Energy has recently issued its hydrogen policy, where it's optional for the proponents of these projects to source renewable energy from the grid as well. So interesting times if these projects get to the execution phase. So before I answer your questions, I think it's important to look at the key takeaways from this presentation and from the MENA Power report that we've just produced. As I said, it has 400 pages of information and analysis that looks at the regulations, projects, demand, and supply trends in each of those countries. So the key takeaways: there's a massive growth of about $230 billion in this region, both conventional and renewable energy, nuclear as well as waste to energy projects. So that's if I mean, it's 1/4 or about 55 billion of these are now under bid. So that's still close to 180 billion worth of projects that will come through the pipeline, and that could that offers opportunities for most of you, whether you're a developer or an EPC contractor. That is another interesting thing. In the past 10 years, we've seen a lot of new developers and EPC contractors, some of them from the region, responding to this demand by establishing those companies. Saudi Arabia remains the largest market for conventional and renewable energy generation, understandably. So I am not sure if you've read that report about so the current official target for Saudi Arabia is 58.7 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2030. But if you consider NEOM's requirements, along with the potential change in demand as they expand in other sectors, then there is that number being floated, which is 130 gigawatts of renewable energy. That has not been confirmed by the Energy Ministry, but that is something that people who are familiar with the thinking in Saudi Arabia have been talking about over the past few months. As you might have noticed, there are increased announcements of projects in Iraq, from renewable energy, gas-fired generation, all the way to retrofits of existing power plants, mainly because it's given that they have a big demand and there's a big deficit in that country in terms of electricity. The same with Lebanon, and of course Egypt these days. So from a severe deficit of capacity in 2014, Egypt went the other way by having a significant surplus in 2018 when it completed the construction of 4 major CCGTs. But since July, I think, since the summer, there have been some regular power cutbacks in the country because there's not enough gas to supply those power plants. So there has been some regular power shortages, power outages in the country in order to save gas, because they also need income they also need to export gas for revenues, for much needed dollar revenues. My take in terms of the levelized electricity costs is that it might rise short term, and we're looking at potentially we're not looking, I think, to a return in the race to the bottom, but from the people, the industry sources, the experts that I've been talking to say it is stabilizing. So someone is asking about the target LCOE. I don't know if the individual clients across this region have individual target LCOEs, but basically the graph I've showed you about the trend shows where they are at, and gives us an idea of where they might be moving over the next 6 to 12 months, depending again in terms of the macroeconomic situations, geopolitics, and how the commodity prices will behave over the next 6 to 12 months. I've talked at length about the supply chain and capacity constraints that have imposed increased EPC costs. And I know that nearly all of you are doing EPC would agree that the prices have gone up substantially since 2019 or before the pandemic and the Russia-Ukraine war. Key role for battery energy storage. Saudi Arabia is planning to build its first phase of the battery energy storage close to the demand centers. So those battery systems will store whatever excess energy to be deployed or released when demand increases. EPC route is gaining traction for fast track projects. As I said, NEOM is pursuing both IPP and EPC in terms of additional in terms of capacity, mainly because there's an urgency in terms of it meeting its self-imposed 2030 target to be powered 100% by renewable energy by 2030. There's also an opportunity. There's Luba Energy Park, if you've heard of it. So they're planning. They've awarded. They've tendered the early works package for that. There will be two small plants, gas-fired plants that will provide to be built on a fast-track basis to deliver electricity to NEOM. But the plan is eventually, over time, to evolve it probably to blend with hydrogen in order for them to reach their net zero target. Procurement delays and retenders cause uncertainty. So we've seen this in some countries in the GCC as well as in Iraq. There have been a lot of announcements, a lot of that. That's why I separated the projects under bid and the projects that are being announced, because there's some uncertainty in terms of some of these projects that have been announced. They have appointed partners but have not yet reached a financial investment decision. So that's that constitutes some uncertainty in terms of the market. Gas as a transition fuel. So this is a very important note to make, as I mentioned in the first few minutes of this presentation, that there's a resurgence of gas generation, mainly because they need to stabilize, to maintain the flexibility of the grid as more diverse sources of energy come on the grid. So so that will contribute to the increased to the trend of increased EPC cost, because again, you're seeing the tenders from Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, potentially Qatar, as well as Abu Dhabi and everywhere else, whether it's Algeria, Morocco, Libya, Iraq. So that gas still plays a very important role going in this energy transition. And as another solution being looked at for countries that are still burning liquid fuel to power their generation plants would be liquid fuel to gas. There's the PP12, I think, in Riyadh that has been recently converted to gas. So all these provide solutions in terms of how these countries can cope with increased demand on one hand, as well as the need to contain carbon emissions in line with your net zero targets. Okay, so I think we have a few minutes for some questions. Right. I heard about Algeria and Germany having talks about green hydrogen. I do not discount that. I will look into that project if it moves forward. But thank you. Do you have a comparison between the EPC cost for gas versus renewable? I don't have that. I did try to come up with the EPC cost for gas, but that's something that I can look at. And it will be an interesting piece of analysis in terms of how they compare. Why do these countries not move to cheap renewables, particularly solar, faster? There is plenty of sun and space available. In Gulf countries, there is also the money to fund it. Right. Well, yeah, they have, well, compared to their, again, to their targets, until last year, for instance, they have been very slow they have lagged behind their, sorry, I'll take that back. They have lagged behind that schedule, but over the last 12 to 18 months, we've seen them, Saudi Arabia in particular, ramping up renewable energy procurement. The UAE has done very well, I think, and they plan to procure 1.5 gigawatts a year. Um, for instance, Abu Dhabi. So they are, I think there's a political will in those countries that I mentioned to meet those targets. As in any long-term target, there might be some delays in some jurisdictions. Of course, there are other countries like Algeria, although Algeria has also awarded several contracts last year or early this year. So it's the first concrete step in terms of its goal to build 22 gigawatts of renewable energy from a few hundred megawatts today. So why are they not moving faster? Of course, there were a lot of considerations in the past, including political considerations, among others. But I think, and I could be wrong, of course, I think the past few months and with COP28 having really set the agenda in terms of where this country should be by 2030 in order to meet their Paris Agreement commitments. I think some countries are waking up and starting to award to acquire renewable energy capacity. Can they do it quicker? Of course. Iraq, for instance, there have been since 2021 about 5.5 gigawatts of renewable energy that has been awarded to potential developers. I mean, preliminary agreements have been signed, but there's still negotiations, and then of course there's change in political leadership over that period, which affect, of course, these negotiations. So there's no two countries with exactly the same realities as far as their policies and politics are concerned, and it affects the pace in which they proceed with their targets to acquire more renewable energy capacity. I hope that answers your question. What is the average LCOE in Saudi Arabia as of today? Um, I, 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 I will have to find out if there's a target LCOE. I don't have that information as of today, I'm afraid. How can we approach SPPC to apply for the unawarded projects? So SPPC, so every procurement round, they would appoint consultants who would issue these RFPs. And if you are a subscriber to me, then we would alert you when there are new tenders being offered. But their website, I would suppose, would provide some links, I'm hoping, in terms of those tenders. What are the factors influencing the price increase? As I said earlier, based on what we know, it's so basically with the push for renewables before 10 years ago, as well as the push for renewables have meant that as well as the COVID-19 pandemic, basically, and the lower demand or pipeline basically led OEMs to not expand or hold off expansion of their capacity to produce these turbines, among others. So that has contributed to the increase in cost. Plus, the supply chain constraints and the cost of commodities have also increased, which have contributed to EPC costs. Are there other factors? There might be, but that's, as far as I know, that are the main contributors in terms of the increased EPC cost. It may not be the entire picture, but that's as far as we know are the factors that's causing EPC costs to go up. Right. I think yeah, we will. There are a few more questions here, but there's another poll that we would hope you would be able to participate in. If you would like us to call you to understand how MEED can support your business, you can answer this, respond to this poll, and then someone from our team can call you if need be. I have my email address shortly. If you need any further information or if we can help you commercially, I will direct it to the right people within our organization who can um, call you and probably work out how we can collaborate. Are there any figures for nuclear energy demand forecast? How would nuclear energy fit into the future energy mix? Very clearly, the UAE has set the stage for not only for the development and the integration of nuclear power source in its energy mix, but also is planning to be a global player in terms of becoming a developer in other regions as well. In terms of nuclear energy targets, apart from Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, and of course Iran, um, I think there have been plans in Jordan to do SMR, small modular reactors, and also, I think Morocco has completed a study to look at renewable energy as a potential part of their energy mix. But yeah, we can look into that. But again, compared to conventional and solar, it will. My guess is it will not be. It will remain um, um, relatively small, but it could expand, and we will continue to look out if other countries will continue to will pursue nuclear power as well. Right. Any specific targets for battery storage systems? Still early days in terms of battery. As I said, we've got Saudi Arabia and Abu Dhabi being in advance in um, about to launch the procurement process for battery energy storage systems. Dubai is planning, I think there's a study, they're looking at battery energy storage systems, and Oman as well. And then of course, if these hydrogen projects do realize, do come to pass, then just like Neom Green Hydrogen project, there will be battery energy demand from those projects as well. Right. Right. Again, we have the MENA Power Report. If you're interested in the analysis and data that we have presented, then there will be this report will provide you with a complete, comprehensive um, information and analysis in terms of how those countries and the opportunities in those countries have. Right. So I think that brings us to a close. There are still a few questions here. I'm afraid we don't have more time. Until the next webinar, thank you so much. And I hope to see you again in our future webinar. Cheers.